Hello, everyone, and welcome to this important discussion towards a bilingual future for English learners. My name is Anya Hurwitz, and I am the Executive Director of SEAL, Sobrato Early Academic Language. We're a California-based nonprofit transforming how schools teach English learner, multilingual learner children from early childhood through elementary. At SEAL, our mission is grounded in a belief that language and language diversity is an asset, a tool for learning and a right. Language is a bridge to identity, community, and academic success. We've spent over a decade and a half working shoulder to shoulder with educators, districts, and communities to bring this vision to life through professional learning, systemic capacity building, research, policy, and advocacy. I want to start by saying how grateful I am that you are all here from across the country and maybe even internationally. And thank you to New America and to each of our incredible panelists and moderators for coming together in this critical moment for bilingual education. This is not just a professional issue. It's deeply personal for so many of us. It's about honoring children's lived experiences, their cultural backgrounds and assets, and their linguistic strengths. Today's discussion is titled Towards a Bilingual Future for English Learners, and we chose that title with intention. We're not here to revisit the question of whether bilingualism matters. The evidence is clear. Bilingual education supports students' development of English, strengthens literacy, boosts academic achievement, overall while simultaneously supporting home language or target language development. And while these benefits extend to all students, they hold particular promise for the 5.3 million students identified as English learners in the United States. And yet, we know far too many English learners still lack access to programs that develop their full linguistic potential. Bilingual education remains out of reach for many of the students who could benefit the most from it. Let me begin by grounding us in what we mean when we say a bilingual future. For this conversation, we're using bilingual education as a broad umbrella that encompasses a range of education models, from programs that aim for biliteracy, as well as those that leverage the development of more than one language or home language more generally. So while you may hear terms like dual language program, bilingual education, and multilingual learner programs used interchangeably, what anchors us is a belief in the power of students learning in two or more languages, the power of home language development, and in building systems that ensure access to that opportunity. Similarly, you will hear us use the term English learner, multilingual learner, and even sometimes emergent bilingual interchangeably. We're referring to children who speak a language other than English at home and are classified as such by their school systems. Terms like multilingual learner and emergent bilingual are more asset-oriented. Yet English learner remains the term most commonly associated with legal protections for these children. So we have two powerful panels for you today. First, a school district perspective, led by Assistant Superintendent Norma Camacho from Azusa Unified in Los Angeles County. She'll walk us through how her district is growing dual language programs, the realities of implementation, and what it means to lead for equity at the local level, especially in a moment when public education is under intense pressure. Then a research panel that brings together some of the most respected scholars in our field. They'll offer insights into the history of English learner policy, the research base on bilingual program effectiveness and the role of teacher preparation, and the current and future landscape of federal and local support. Now, I'd be remiss not to acknowledge the broader context we're in. This is a time of both opportunity and very real challenge. On the one hand, we've seen great momentum over the last years. Families, school communities, educators across the country are advocating for bilingual education and expanding programs. And on the other hand, we're seeing proposed federal cuts to Title III, cuts to research funding, delays in releasing promised resources, communities living in a constant state of fear, and growing instability across public education at a time when schools need more support, not less. It's important to keep in mind English learners have civil rights. Their right to a high quality education is protected, and that does not disappear in the midst of politically charged chaos. That's why, in the face of those constraints, this conversation isn't about what we cannot do. It's about what we can do and what many of you are doing. States and districts have both an opportunity and a responsibility to lead. In California, we're working to ensure local control and state policy is used to build strong bilingual education systems. We're asking school boards, superintendents, and state leaders and agencies to send a clear message to educators and to communities about what effective practice looks like and to provide tools to make it happen. We can and must leverage existing state and local resources to build out these programs. Even if federal dollars diminish, we have the capacity to expand access, to strengthen instruction, and build systems that truly reflect the assets our students bring to school with them. They need this now more than ever. We have momentum, we have an imperative, and we have research and models that work. Today's conversation will bring that momentum to life, lifting up what's working, confronting the challenges, and advancing a shared vision for a bilingual future that centers multilingual learners. Thank you again for being part of this dialogue. And now I'm very honored to introduce our first panel, Norma Camacho from Azusa Unified School District, in conversation with education reporter Tara Garcia Mathewson. Let's get started.
Thank you, Anya. And Norma, I'd like you to start for the audience. Place your district. Tell us about your community, the demographics. Anya mentioned you're in LA County. What does that mean? Your community looks like?
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. Azusa Unified is a close-knit, community-centered district. We are located in the San Gabriel Valley. Our student population and our community is rich in culture, language, and heritage. We are approximately 90% identifying as Latino, Latinx. We are so proud, really, to serve a dynamic group of students, approximately 26% emerging bilinguals, who really bring valuable linguistic and cultural assets to our classrooms. Additionally, about 88% of our students come from socioeconomically disadvantaged backgrounds, which really strengthens our commitment to providing equitable opportunities and support systems for all of our learners.
And so your district, the model in Azusa is dual language. How many schools have dual language programs? How many students are they serving?
Absolutely. So we have dual language programs at three of our elementary schools. Two elementary schools have Spanish dual language immersion strands, and one is a newly implemented Mandarin dual language strand. Our Spanish dual language elementaries begin with a preschool classroom through fifth grade. And our Spanish dual language track is currently at the middle school, with our eighth grade cohort transitioning to high school in the fall. And our Mandarin classroom will be adding or our Mandarin dual language strand will be adding a first grade next year. So in our district, approximately 650 students are served in our dual language immersion programs.
And out of that 650, what portion are English learners?
Approximately 40 to 45%. And I'm going to say that as ever ELs. Many of the students in our dual language programs have reclassified, but they started off as English learners. So we are running about approximately 40 to 45%.
Okay. And tell us, how long have these programs been running and kind of what was the genesis for starting these programs?
Absolutely. So I have had the fortune of not just working all of my career here in Azusa. I grew up here in Azusa. So Azusa has had a long-standing commitment to bilingual education. I was a student in Azusa Unified Bilingual Education in the 80s. And when I began teaching in the district in 1997, the district already had a longstanding transitional bilingual program in place. However, that did slowly begin to fall away with the English only priorities in the early 2000s. But the district was able to maintain one dual language strand at one school. And over time, we did recognize the need to strengthen and expand our approach to better serve our students and our community. So in 2016, we made a strategic shift. We launched two dual language immersion strands at two different sites. So two of the elementary schools, we had two strands. So two kindergarten classrooms we launched, as well as a TK and a preschool that year. And really, the shift was rooted in leveraging the cultural and linguistic strengths of our students, and also really looking at what research was showing in terms of dual language being the most effective model for English learners. We did have an achievement gap, and we were really looking to address that in a research-based, effective way, while also looking to our greater community and the assets that we had there. So really focusing less on, this subtractive idea, but really additive. And we focused our work in those initial stages on developing a comprehensive master plan that would guide the implementation and the expansion. So we began with adding one grade level at a time to really build out a full TK-12 pathway. And so we are incredibly proud to be launching in our eighth grade cohort, seeing that eighth grade cohort moving to the high school, because that was the group that was kind of our DLI 2.0, if you will. So it is incredibly fulfilling to see that vision come to fruition, and just really continuing to invest in the equity and excellence for our students.
And so just placing your district's timeline in the wider California policy timeline. So these programs started in 2016, which is the same year that California voters essentially overturned the ban on bilingual programs. Did your district wait for that state approval, or were you already moving forward and expecting to get kind of permission from each family to participate, kind of thing?
We were already beginning to lay the groundwork, really beginning that communication to develop interest, so that we would ensure that we had seats full. We also really were looking to message to our English learner families about this program. Um, because one of the things that we were confronting with dual language, the original little strand that we had, is that not many of our emerging bilingual families, just kind of based on their understandings, maybe past experiences, they felt that their students were better served in English only kinds of programs. And so really there was some groundwork to be done in working with our community to invite them to be a part of this, and that was really just about establishing trust and just being transparent about what research is saying, and just bringing them along in those ways.
Mhm. And so that kind of recruitment element is, I imagine, an ongoing challenge. And you talked about the idea of growing conscientiously year by year. Are there other challenges you want to highlight about getting these programs off the ground, or as you're thinking about starting new ones? Yeah, what's the hardest part of this?
Yes, so absolutely. Building trust and helping families understand really the long-term benefits of bilingualism and biliteracy, and just being really very intentional about that. We um, have addressed some of those things with particularly ensuring that our English learners have um, access and to these programs in terms of the schools that are offering them, the accessibility for those families to be a part of that. We didn't want access to the program in terms of distance for families who would be walking to be a barrier. Also, really looking at staffing. We were fortunate because the district had a just a long-standing belief in bilingualism. We had many teachers who were certified to teach in a bilingual setting. However, post-COVID, we did experience some staffing challenges. And then we really began to just build from inside, identifying staff who, either had a bilingual certification but hadn't used it. We offered stipends. Not just for teachers who had bilingual certifications, but additional stipends for teachers who would teach in the dual language program. So really investing in our teaching staff to demonstrate our commitment to the program that really assisted us with overcoming some of the staffing challenges. But what I will say is probably the most critical piece in overcoming challenges is having strong support from district leadership, particularly our Board of Education, bringing them along in the initial stages. We brought forth, California has the English Learner Roadmap, which really outlines the most effective practices in terms of programming and services for students. And we brought that forth with our Board of Education, offering study sessions to really help us, build that support from the top down.
And I imagine that top-down support is going to be tied to outcomes. And so can you talk about what you're tracking? How are you kind of making the case that these programs are worth investing in and maintaining this commitment to?
Absolutely. And so not just from top down, but also to families. Just saying that these programs are effective are not necessarily enough, right? So we do use a range of data sources to assess the effectiveness of our programs, really with a strong focus, particularly on the outcomes for our English learner students. So that includes analyzing disaggregated, not just state data, but also our own internal, local, and formative assessments, and really closely monitoring those to track the academic growth of our students in our dual language classes. Our English learners in dual language classes versus our English learners in our structured English immersion settings. But also beyond academics, we've also
Before you move on from academics, can you give it, are there any general numbers that you can tell us in terms of how English learners are actually performing across the different English only versus bilingual programs?
Absolutely. So our English learners who have been part of our dual language programs outperform even our English only students in English language arts and mathematics. They also reclassify at a higher rate than our English learners in our SEI, which is our structured English immersion setting. So we have, really track that data and put that data forth. Anya talked a little bit about local control. Here in California, we have an LCAP, and part of our LCAP is establishing goals. One of those goals is around the achievement of English learners. So our metrics in that goal are specifically tied to our local data as well as our state data in terms of really looking at how our English learners in our dual language programs are achieving, as well as our English learners in our SEI programs. So that has been critical in maintaining support from leadership for continuing our program.
Yeah,
Um,
and that's such important data. And I don't know how broadly our participant base is here, but it would be great if states collected this data and was able to show people more broadly how English learners are performing across programs. So it's wonderful at the district level that you're really following that. And I interrupted you. You were going to talk about some other outcomes as well with your
oh, No, absolutely. So we also really look at student experience. So we collect survey data from our students, families, as well as teachers to really understand that sense of belonging and cultural representation, as well as overall engagement that students are having. And we've really seen an increase in student perception of their own representation in classrooms and the materials that they're using. It's helped us to ensure that our programs are not just academically effective, but also culturally affirming and inclusive for our students and for our families.
hmm And now let's place this in the current political moment, right? How is the current political environment affecting your programs, your students, your families?
So, the current political climate, especially right now in Los Angeles County, it is creating fear and some uncertainty among our immigrant community here in Azusa. But we are being mindful in how this might impact our families. We've um, tried to kind of anticipate what potential impacts this might have on new families who might be completing a home language survey, who might be reticent to disclose information about primary language for fear of, how that might identify them in some way. So really thinking about how we are, sharing with families what information um, uh, uh, people have access to, if you will, and what is confidential here in the district, because we don't want to find ourselves in a situation of under identifying students who could benefit from language supports. We have community liaisons who have been actively doing some outreach right now while we are on summer break to just reach out to families to see, what they're feeling, how we can support them, and really just thinking about how we are engaging with them. And again, we really value our community, and we have trust from our community, and our goal is really just to ensure that our families know that their students are safe, that they are respected in our district, and we just want to empower them. We don't want what's happening outside to influence how our families are feeling about participating, particularly in a dual language program, for fear of what that might identify for somebody else, because we do really celebrate the language and the culture of our community. And that doesn't happen through us here in the school district, but also partnership with our city council and, other partners in the community.
And in our final couple minutes, can you just talk about program expansion? What are the plans for bilingual education in your district in the coming years?
Absolutely. So, as I shared a little earlier, we are looking forward to our cohort moving up to the high school. And I know, our high school teachers are very excited to have them. And our family is also excited. Families are excited. This first time that we have dual language at the high school level. So, really embarking on uncharted territory. I also shared that we have launched a Mandarin dual language program. We do always look to the demographics and what's happening in our community. So we began to see a growing Mandarin speaking community. We have, really looked to launching that. And we were thrilled that our TK classroom is already full. All of the seats are full. That never happens. Usually our families wait to join into classrooms until later in the summer. So we know that that's something that is being embraced by our families, and that particular program is over 50% EL in the Mandarin program. So we are very excited about that. We also, continue to closely examine our programming, dual language programs, as well as a need to expand to other kinds of bilingual programs. We have slowly added a heritage language program at our secondary sites. We have some newcomer students that can benefit from that type of programming. But always in that cycle of continuous improvement to really look at our programs with a critical eye, just to ensure that they are effective and responsive to the needs of our students and to our greater community.
Wonderful. Well, we've hit our time. I'm going to hand it over to the researcher panel. But if people have questions for Norma, drop them into your chat and we might be able to have time for them at the end. Thank you.
Shall I go ahead and begin? Okay, well, I'm very excited to moderate the next panel discussion. My name is Martha Martinez, and I am the head of research and evaluation at SEAL, Sobrato Early Academic Language. And the topic of our discussion couldn't be more timely. Given the current state of affairs, which we've already begun talking about, it's important to take a step back and reflect on the evolution of English learner education and its relationship to bilingual education, and to lean on one another for inspiration and ideas about how to build a brighter tomorrow, even in the midst of tough times. We have a rock star panel of experts on multilingual learner education and bilingual education who will help us remember the past, consider the present, and plan for a bilingual future for all students in the United States, including those who come to school speaking a language other than English. We're going to begin with a series of questions for each of our panelists before we turn to some other questions for any panel member to answer at that time. Before we start, I'll go ahead and introduce our rockstar panel of researchers. First, we have Dr. Chris Monticello, leader. I hope I pronounced that right. She's an associate professor at multilingual learner education at the University of Massachusetts Lowell. We have Dr. Magali Lavadens, who is Levy Presidential Endowed Chair in Moral and Ethical Leadership, and also the Executive Director of the Center for Equity for English Learners at Loyola Marymount University. We have Dr. Ilana Umansky, who's an Associate Professor of Education Policy and Leadership, as well as Quantitative Research Methods in the College of Education at the University of Oregon. And we have Dr. Kate Mencken, who is Professor of Linguistics and a Research Fellow at the Research Institute for the Study of Language in an Urban Society at Queens College in the City University of New York. And for the rest of our discussion today, I'm going to be referring to each of the panelists by their first names. And the first question I have is for Kate. The current presidential administration is advancing an agenda that threatens to dismantle federal supports for multilingual learner students. Can you provide a bit of historical perspective about how far we've come in terms of how we serve English learners in K-12 schools and how that progress might be disrupted by recent proposals that aim to shrink the federal government's role in education?
Sure. So thank you so much for the opportunity to be with all of you, and good afternoon from New York City. So bilingual education in the US today really has its origins in the civil rights movement of the 1960s and was part of broader struggles by immigrant and migrant communities, particularly Latinx, for racial and social justice. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was really the first federal recognition that language can be a source of inequity in schools. And the Federal Bilingual Education Act of 1968 was the official response really to community organizing and activism. And the Bilingual Education Act mandated that services be provided in school to ensure that multilingual learners were able to learn English. And since then, programs such as bilingual education have proliferated, and with good reason. There's now a robust and convincing base of research documenting the many benefits of bilingual education and how multilingual learners in bilingual programs will typically outperform their peers enrolled in monolingual programs and benefit academically, linguistically, cognitively, socio-emotionally. I could go on, but particularly from sustained long-term developmental bilingual programs just like Assistant Superintendent Camacho was describing. And Dr. Umansky is going to talk a little bit more about that. But it seems to be said, but I feel like I just need to say, though, that today, the vast majority of multilingual learners in schools still are in English-only educational programs, in spite of this ample research base that supports bilingual education. And even though research evidence is really clear, but language policy decisions are at times more political than they are pedagogical. But due to the promise of bilingual education approaches, there are recent efforts in many districts on bilingual education expansion and making sure, a critical piece of this is making sure that those expansion efforts actually increase the enrollment of multilingual learners specifically in those bilingual programs. And this includes also students with disabilities, but multilingual learners with disabilities who have historically often been shut out of bilingual education spaces, even though bilingual programs are so necessary for meeting their intersectional needs. So, within the US policy context, our system of education is decentralized, and in that much responsibility for educational policy and the delivery of services, inclusive of those for multilingual learners, remains at the state and local levels. This is something that Anya was alluding to. However, the federal government continues to play an extremely important role. And multilingual learners have several key federal rights, including the right to a free public education, regardless of immigration status or language background, and the right to receive appropriate language support services. So for instance, under Title III, this includes access to the core curriculum, qualified teachers, appropriate materials, the opportunity to learn English while accessing content, instruction, and other subject areas. And multilingual learners have to be identified and to be classified as multilingual learners and will only be reclassified when they pass an English language proficiency exam. And parents and families of multilingual learners have the right to translation and interpretation services to participate in their child's education. So as as was mentioned earlier, more recently, the Trump administration's recommended defunding Title III of the Every Student Succeeds Act. So I want, just touching briefly on the implications, The supports that I mentioned are all funded under Title III, and this is important categorical funding that targets support specifically for multilingual learners, that supplements and does not supplant, meaning it doesn't replace existing services that schools are already required to provide under other laws like the Civil Rights Act, the Equal Educational Opportunities Act. And so see, these are some of the ways that funding is used and what's at stake if it disappears. So I know that in New York and elsewhere, we are organizing and happy to talk a little bit more about those efforts later but I'm aware of time and I'm ready to pass it on. I was
Okay.
told 5 minutes, so I'm
Yeah, I know. I thought we had a little more time too, and I was like, oh, okay, sorry about that. So so hopefully we can come back and talk some more about what you would hope to cover right in this session, and really about the federal rights that it should be protected for multilingual learners. And I'm glad you were able to paint this relationship too with bilingual education, which was clear from the very beginning, as well as your comment about states really having considerable discretion, right, in deciding how best to educate EL identified students, including whether they should be educated in English only or English dominant classrooms. In California, we have a policy where we call these sheltered English instruction, and versus in bilingual or dual language settings. And the research really is kind of pointing to the promise of bilingual education, has been pointing to that for quite some time, and especially long-term dual language programs, those that instruct students in 2 languages beginning in kindergarten and that last at least through the elementary school grades. And these programs have gained in momentum and popularity over the last 15 years. So my next question is for Alana, because you've done a lot of research about bilingual and dual language education. What does the research say about the effectiveness of bilingual versus English only settings, specifically for English learners? And are English learners benefiting from the increasing popularity and growth of dual language programs in the United States?
Thanks so much, Martha. And yeah, it's a real pleasure to be with all of you here today. So that's right. Federal and case law, including the Civil Rights Act that Kate brought up, the Equal Educational Opportunities Act, state that EL classified students have to be, laws that have emerged from them state that EL classified students have to be provided with an educational program that ensures equal access to grade level content and supports in learning English. But states and local jurisdictions have the authority to design and choose the educational program or programs that we want. And we got to hear about that in Azusa from Norma. So bilingual education is one such set of programs. And within that umbrella, there are many different designs of programs that differ in terms of who can enroll in them, how long the programs run, the balance between English and the partner language, who teaches and how they teach, what the long-term goals of the program are. But as has been stated by everyone so far, we have a very strong research base now on the relative effectiveness of bilingual programs writ large, thanks to studies that really date back all the way to the 1980s and continue to this day. It is worth mentioning that the quality and rigor of the studies is increasingly really strong. Many of these studies draw on methods that allow for causal inference, meaning that we can really identify the direct effects of being in a bilingual program compared to having not been in a bilingual program. So the big picture in terms of this research base is that there is variation in the quality and effectiveness of individual bilingual programs, just like there is variation in the effectiveness of any program. But on average, bilingual programs benefit students, and particularly English learner classified students, when compared to being in an English only program. And this is on a wide range of student outcomes. And that's been mentioned too by the folks so far on this panel today. So I want to go through some of the main findings briefly that again have been alluded to. The first is academic benefits. So we see that students, EL classified students in bilingual programs have a benefit to their academic outcomes. This includes language arts, math, social studies, and science. And this is likely for a range of reasons, but a big reason is that students are most likely learning these subjects or many of these subjects in the language that they're strongest in. And so that's probably one of the big reasons we see these academic benefits. We also have seen that EL classified students in bilingual programs are more likely to become English proficient and to reclassify out of EL status. Some research suggests that it can take a little longer on average for these students to be reclassified, but more of them eventually do. More of these students are successful. And this might seem a little counterintuitive at first, but it likely relates to the fact that we now know that when you have a stronger basis in your dominant or home language, it facilitates learning of additional languages. So that's English proficiency and academic outcomes. We also know from research that unsurprisingly, students in bilingual programs have stronger outcomes with regards to their home or heritage language. So this is true in terms of, this is one reason why this is important is that students are oftentimes given a real chance at learning literacy in their home language, even if they're coming into school already with relatively strong oral language skills in their home language. Let's see, there's also benefits. I have many more that I can talk about, but I don't have all day. Attainment is critically important. We see this across studies, but there's a recent study that show that students in bilingual programs are 6 percentage points more likely to graduate and 9 percentage points more likely to graduate with a regular diploma. And this is really important because it allows them to then go on to higher education. And it points to some of these critically important socio-emotional and socio-cultural benefits of education, of bilingual education. So these relate to having a stronger sense of identity, self-confidence, well-being in school. We see that students in bilingual programs have stronger connections to family and more intergenerational communication, greater pride in culture and connection to their heritage. So there are many, many more, just a couple that I'll mention that we see in diverse studies that have been conducted are that we also see greater family engagement in bilingual programs, greater diversity, attracting of a more diverse teaching base, and less biased assumptions on the part of teachers about the skill levels of their students. So yeah, in some we have a very strong research base at this point that bilingual education benefits multilingual students. It benefits all students, but it specifically benefits multilingual students across a range of important outcomes. And again, I just want to end by saying implementation is key, and Norma talked to us about that. So how bilingual programs are implemented, the amount of support they have from leaders, the kinds of resources they have are critical, but on average, we know that bilingual programs are highly beneficial for multilingual students. Thank you.
Thank you, Alana. And we're also hoping that we can get some questions from the audience. And I'm not sure also if there's some technical difficulties in getting those questions in. So hopefully we can get that resolved so that we can get some questions in from the audience as well. I know we've got a wealth of expertise on the panel, and we could be talking in much more depth about each of these questions that I'm posing to you all, and I'll be returning to some of them as part of the Q&A after these preliminary questions. One question in particular was about access. So we didn't get to talk about that, Alana, in this last piece about EL's access to these programs, but hopefully we can return to that at the Q&A section. So we'll move on to this next part of the conversation that we want to have with you all here, which is about the role of teachers. We know that teachers play a huge role in the quality of education a student receives. And this is another area in which states have considerable discretion, since they set the policies related to teacher preparation and licensure. So my next question is for Chris. You conducted a national study of EL teacher credentialing requirements and professional teaching standards and uncovered several inconsistencies across the states. Can you share some more details about these findings and their broader implications?
Sure, thank you. So I'm going to really build a lot on, I think, what we've heard already from our panelists. But as Kate and Alana touched on already, when students are classified as English learners, they're legally entitled to specialized English language services. And while the federal government sets that mandate, as Martha just mentioned again, they leave it up to individual states, right, to determine what that looks like. And I'll just talk a bit about what that means in terms of teacher preparation. So I work in Massachusetts. And Massachusetts is a state that mandates specialized teacher training for English learners, for teachers who work with English learners and other multilingual learner students. So specifically in my state, we have a standalone English as a second language license for teachers who do the legally mandated targeted English language development instruction. We also have a bilingual education endorsement for teachers who work in bilingual ed programs. And in our state, we require that all core academic teachers who work with classified English learners, which at this point is basically every single classroom, right, they're required to have a sheltered English immersion endorsement. And that's a credential that's earned on top of your initial teaching license. Personally, the sheltered English immersion endorsement, it's earned by just taking like a 14-week course. I wish that training requirement was more robust. But after doing this study, I realized it's definitely better than nothing, which is the case, unfortunately, in many states. For us in Massachusetts, you can earn the ESL license or bilingual ed endorsement by completing a state-approved program. So I want to start by talking specifically about the ESL license, because that's actually what prompted me to do this study. So also, as Alana and Kate both alluded to already, the majority of classified English learners, they're in English-only instruction, right? And so coming back to Massachusetts, ESL is a standalone license, meaning you can earn this license with a specialization in ESL, right? That's obtained through a state licensure program, or you can earn it as an add-on license. And it's this add-on license option where things get interesting. So in Massachusetts, if you already hold an initial license in any content area, say you're a licensed elementary school teacher or a licensed high school social studies teacher, right? You can add that ESL license by just taking the MTEL, which is our state subject matter test, and doing an 100-hour practicum equivalent, which is essentially spending 100 hours with classified English learners, which for many teachers can just happen in their current teaching position, right? So essentially, like, no specific coursework is required. Right. So in practice, this looks like, at least in Massachusetts, there's several teachers who hold an ESL license, but they have not actually had any specialized training in, say, language acquisition, linguistics, or specifically teaching reading to students learning a new language. Right. So I did this study because I was genuinely wondering, like, what do other states require? And I admittedly naively went into the study thinking that other states must be doing better. I don't have time to discuss all the findings, but I'll highlight a few things. So first, we found that Massachusetts having a standalone license for ESL, a specialized endorsement for bilingual ed, and mandating sheltered English immersion endorsements for all core academic teachers, it's actually quite robust by comparison to many states. Many states, at least at the time of the study, we did this in 2020, they don't have a core requirement like a sheltered English immersion endorsement for all teachers. Several states also don't even have credentials for teaching in a bilingual education setting, right? So like disappointingly, only about half of the states, again, this was in 2020, even have a credential specifically for teaching in bilingual ed settings. And of those states that do have some sort of bilingual ed training requirement, only 8 of those states actually require that you go through a full program to earn that credential. right? So other states where you can get specialized training or specialized credential for working in a bilingual ed program, they include one or a combination of passing a state bilingual ed assessment, a subject matter test, coursework, practicum, or demonstration of language proficiency either in English or in another language, right? So it's kind of all over the map. With what these requirements are. And similarly, how I had mentioned how in Massachusetts, the ESL license can be earned by a licensed teacher by just passing a test and doing a practicum equivalent. In many states, this add-on credential is earned by just passing a test, right? Meaning no coursework or field experience is even required, right? So coming back to what that means for English learners and multilingual students, first, these not so robust teacher ed requirements mean that many of the roughly 5 million classified English learners in the US are in classrooms, including bilingual programs, with teachers who don't necessarily have robust and appropriate training to work with them in the first place. Right. And I don't love statistics that compare classified English learners to monolingual populations, but in those statistics, especially when we look at English learners who receive English only instruction, and we know that that's where the majority of English learners are currently in the US, we see over and over across so many indicators of academic performance, from test scores to attendance to graduation rates, that English learners are not performing well. And I would argue that's not because they aren't capable, it's because the teachers don't have the robust, sufficient training required to support their diverse needs, right? To really meet them where they are. So I'll stop here, but I think one of the biggest takeaways is our multilingual learner populations deserve better. As Alana and Kate really mentioned, they deserve access to bilingual education, and in any education setting that they're in, you know, they're legally entitled to having equitable access to education by high quality teachers. And so I think a big takeaway from this study is really urging states to consider not just the program offerings available, but to take more seriously these training requirements and expectations that we have for teachers who are working with multilingual learners across all education settings.
Thank you, Chris. I think it's also important to recognize too that that's just the beginning, right? The teacher's education continues throughout their profession, and it's important to keep up that professional development because you learn by doing, and in doing, then you learn what you don't know as well. So the next question, we're going to turn now back actually to the federal government's role again in supporting education. And the federal government provides important financial support to improve the educational experiences and outcomes of multilingual learners via education research grants and Title III funds, among other ways. This question is for Magali. How have federal education research funds supported your efforts to improve teacher preparation and the educational outcomes of English learners? And what are the implications for EL educational services and bilingual programming, given the likelihood of much more limited federal education research funding and possibly less Title III funding support in the coming years?
Yeah, thank you, Martha. And it's a pleasure to be here among all these wonderful panelists. And this question is of vital importance. You heard about what some of those research funds have been allowing us to ask certain questions about the federal protections that are indicated by law, and questions about effectiveness and how those laws are implemented and the programmatic options for English learners in a variety of program models. So the essential role includes funding and resources for some interagency collaboration. Over the last few years, there have been greater support from the National Professional Development Grant, the Office of English Learner Acquisition, which we also know has been pretty much decimated in the U.S. Department of Education under the threat to public education overall. But we've also seen some really interesting patterns of interagency support for multilingualism beyond the Department of Education, including agencies such as the National Strategic Language Initiatives by the U.S. Department of Education, which offered support for Mandarin and other strategic languages, the Department of Defense that offered similar support, and partnered teacher training, teacher professional development, and professional development with multilingual learner supports. And then for me, it's actually both very personal as an English learner and an immigrant, a former immigrant, and also as the recipient of a termination letter for the first ever National Content Center on English Learners and Multilingualism, which is currently under the appeal. So that center was really to expand what states were indicating through a variety of studies as a greater growth in response to both teacher preparation and also professional development to enhance capacities. So what have been some of the interagency supports? Well, you heard Ilana talk about how some of the research that she's done, funded by the Institute of Education Sciences, that focus on specific English learner research questions and other Title III supported initiatives. Those have been central to my work. In 2006, I started the Center for Equity for English Learners really to look for both research, policy, and practice. And that triad of work that we need to continue to do, research and policy and practice, call us to engage with each other more strategically and more intentionally, as Anya indicated early on. So what has some of those trends been in terms of supporting English learners to deepen and expand the work that Azusa has been doing, and that in the pre-service area that has been developing pathways for bilingual teacher preparation. The Grow Your Own programs that we saw funded by the recent round of National Professional Development Grants were just underway, and they allow us to ask key questions about those pathways and to be more strategic and intentional about the preparation of bilingual teachers. Chris mentioned EL teacher standards for preparation vary greatly, are pretty not rigorous. We're finding the same thing in a different analyses that we're doing around bilingual teacher preparation. In states, for example, that have other initiatives such as the Seal of Biliteracy, the State Seals of Biliteracy, which we know all 50 states have passed a high school seal of biliteracy. And that's a unique pathway that we can respond to the growth in demand for bilingual dual language programs for English learners and other populations, but also to prepare teachers and identify them earlier. We know that some of our studies have been truncated that were longitudinal in nature. So when we look at robust longitudinal studies to understand the conditions, the instructional practices that are able to point to those outcomes, those have been truncated by the cutbacks that we've had in the federal government to not just OELA, to Title III, but to other governmental agencies. We also know that some of these grants have supported, and we need further study in the professional learning networks and the communities of practice that build and support models that really transform educator, both at the classroom level, teachers in the classroom, as well as administrators that we know need that kind of knowledge building and capacity building to implement rigorous and robust program models for English learners leading to multilingualism. Azusa and our center at LMU have partnered with the Sobrato Early Academic Language and model, SEAL with an S, our sponsors, our co-sponsors for this event. And we're exploring, we're in our final stages of looking at a longitudinal study to see what were the impacts on academic achievement of those students. So in order to be able to evaluate and refine program implementation, including dual language, secondary programs, we really need to think about a different policy ecology for multilingual education. What does that mean? It really means engaging in those partnerships through design, through intentionality, through those strategic partnerships based on not just what the legal protections are. The legal protections, in my mind, are the minimum that we should be doing for English learners. They are the minimum. We need to think about what are our moral and legal imperatives and demands for all of us to engage in this larger context that we're living in this particular moment at the state and local level. So research engagement means we need to seek out and rely on better partnerships, research practice partnerships, research policy practice partnerships. We need to engage with business and with philanthropy to really carry out some of the gaps that we have. Title III funding is really a minimal amount of funding that each English learner receives when you look at it from an individual basis. But the designs that Azusa has provided, for example, in the growth and expansion of their dual language model, that Norma spoke about was really building the capacity and the knowledge of the board, building the capacity and the knowledge of the community, of the parents and the families, making schools a safe place, making sure that the resources in the local control accountability plan are really there. So what we really need in this moment is advocacy at all of these levels of our policy ecology to really advance and improve multilingual outcomes for our English learners. Thank you.
Thank you, Magali. So I want to remind the audience to submit their questions. And I think if you refresh your browser too, you may see a chat box that perhaps didn't appear previously. So we do want to answer your questions as well. We have plenty of our own, but we would love to also respond to any questions that you might have of the panel too. So I want to return to one of the questions that we weren't able to get to, and both Kate and Alana were alluding to this about EL's. We know now the research base, right, around the power of bilingual education, dual language programming. And so can you, either of you may perhaps speak to whether or not English learners are gaining access to these programs, and what are some ways that we might be able to ensure that they have access to these types of programs moving forward?
Sure. So this has actually there have been issues. Dual language programs are enormously popular in many places around the US, as there's, kind of framings of bilingual education as opportunities for English monolinguals to add another language to their linguistic repertoire, which is really desirable in the workplace, et cetera. So the concern is making sure that when bilingual education programs expand, that what we are doing is actually expanding seats for multilingual learners, because as these programs have become so desirable, this has even been termed a gentrification of bilingual education. As these programs have become so desirable to privileged families, we want to make sure that we hold true to the original social justice aims of those programs. And so there are a lot of efforts underway right now to address some of those issues, because it's wonderful that people are supporting bilingual education and are so interested and engaged with it, but really just making sure that there's allocation of seats, for example, that are for multilingual learners, because these are not choice programs for this population of students, they're necessary. And holding, just making sure that that's centered. In fact, Garrett Delavan, Juan Freire, and I recently co-edited a book that talks about solutions to addressing this issue of the gentrification of these programs. And it's solutions oriented. So.
Yeah, I'll just add a couple of thoughts to what Kate just said. Part of that obviously is planning, and Norma talked about this in terms of where you're placing programs. So making sure that you're placing programs in neighborhoods where multilingual students can have access to them. And I just want to bring up one other issue related to this, which I think got brought up. Maybe Kate, you brought it up earlier about multilingual students with disabilities. That there are specific populations that we also really need to look out for and make sure that they have access. Multilingual students with disabilities is one such group. Another group is newcomer students. I've been to bilingual programs where when students come in at higher grades, they're not allowed into those programs. So really just making sure that we're making these programs fully accessible to the full range of multilingual students, whether it's EL classified or not EL classified, disability, newcomer, et cetera. So I think thinking about the vast diversity of multilingual students and making sure that we're making the programs accessible to all of them.
Thank you. And I actually oversaw a couple of dual language grants when I worked at the Oregon Department of Education, and this was also very important to us to ensure equitable access. And a couple of ways that we did that was in the grant RFP, it specifically specified that they needed to demonstrate to us that they were prioritizing access for English learners to their programs that they were planning then to either start or expand. And then the other ways in which it can be done at the local level is that districts then can make sure that they create policies where there is a rolling admissions basis for families, because sometimes these families don't make the kindergarten deadline, and they enter school at different times. And so there's ways in which the districts can ensure that that English learners, multilingual learners, students, and their families have access to these programs. So we actually have a question from an audience member. So I'm excited about that. And I do want to pose it. And I feel like that it's not just for this panel, but especially Norma, if she would want to weigh in. It is, what advice would you have for families who would like to start a dual immersion program in a district that currently does not offer one?
I would say the first step would be at perhaps the school site you're at, gathering together, meeting with a principal, expressing your interest, putting your interest in writing. I know here in California, there are policies tied to families who are asking for dual language programs. That would be my recommendation, is starting with site leadership, and then bringing that to the district level, looking toward directors of state and federal programs that might oversee multilingual programs, to begin kind of a grassroots effort, because sometimes that moves the needle a little quicker. So that would be my recommendation.
Tara, you actually put something in the chat, and I want to open it up for you to actually mention another way, and then it sounds like there's another question that you might want to follow up from the previous panel.
Yeah, so I don't know who asked that question about families interested in starting a program, but if you are in California, or maybe a couple other states have this too, there's essentially a trigger law. So if enough parents come together and say they want a program, I think, Norma, you're nodding your head, so maybe you know whether it's 20 or 30 parents. 20. So if 20 parents come together and say they want this program, the school district has to look into starting it. And so they can get out of it, but they have to at least give it best effort. If it's possible to start the program, they have to. And so I don't know if any other panelists know, maybe New York has one of these as well, Illinois.
It does. Yeah, and Illinois. Do you want me to answer?
Sure.
So yeah, like states like New York, there are about 5 states nationally that mandate the provision of bilingual education when there are enough multilingual learners who speak the same home language per grade to make a program viable. So in New York, that's defined as 15 at the elementary level and 20 at the secondary level. And that is, it's statewide. And so what they say is if you have 15 or more multilingual learners per grade within an entire school district, then bilingual education legally must be provided. And I know that Illinois does have a policy. I believe Texas also, and I can't remember offhand the others, but it was about 5 the last time I checked.
Yeah, I know Texas and Illinois and New York, theirs are mandated based on enrollment. The California law is just about parent advocacy. It's not, there's no formal trigger necessarily based on enrollment. But one other question to bring Norma back into the conversation, there was an audience question about demand and the idea that the Mandarin program is already full. Can you talk, do you have a sense of why there's more hesitancy among the Latino immigrant population versus or heritage speakers from the Latino community versus the Chinese community?
So we had to do a lot of work in dispelling some things. So in the late 90s, early 2000s, when I was teaching, there was a lot of widespread messaging targeted to Spanish-speaking communities in policy and public discourse, that bilingual programs were failing students. And so families felt that learning English as quickly as possible was that path to success. So we really had to dispel that. And also there's um, the broader issue, right, of how languages are valued differently in society. And, we, our teachers in our Spanish dual language programs have really worked to lift up that Spanish is an asset, because Spanish hasn't always been treated as an asset in educational settings. We've really worked to dispel these kind of implicit messages about language status as well. But also, I think with Mandarin, the other piece to that is that because there are less Mandarin programs, sometimes there's more demand. So a little of some of those things is kind of what our hunches are.
Thank you. And I have another question actually that came in from the audience that I would like to pose to the panel. It is in the preparation of multilingual teachers nationwide, what do you see as the two major areas of need in terms of rigorous professional preparation? And this is probably in Chris and Magali's wheelhouse.
Chris, you want to go first and then I'll take it after.
Sure. So that's a great question. I have like a list of 1,000 things that I'd like to list there. I think what I want to talk about though is I think sometimes we need to rethink the way we think about like robust and rigorous training. I know when I answered Martha's question, I was, talking a lot about how like I want requirements to be more, robust and that we have all that. At the same time, like in Massachusetts, we do have very robust pathways to teacher training, and that robustness actually leaves out a lot of people. Right, to eventually become multilingual teachers. So, like in Massachusetts, I think one of the biggest challenges that we face is the potential pool of multilingual teachers, and I think this is the case nationwide. It's limited to people who are already multilingual. And in Massachusetts, we were an English only state for 15 years. So we raised an entire generation of people to be monolingual, right? And so thinking about that, and then also in many states, the bilingual education endorsement to work in a multilingual program, it's an add-on, right? Which really means that credentials and training for people to work in a multilingual program, it's restricted to licensed teachers, and really not just licensed teachers who are multilingual. And we know the majority of teachers in the United States are white monolingual women. Right. And so I wanted to, Magali, you had mentioned the Grow Your Own round of funding that came in the last National Professional Development cycle. And UMass Lowell, where I work, we were one of the recipients for that last round of funding. And something that we're trying to do is to think a little bit differently about like rigorous and robust teacher training can look like, because we know that there are so many bilingual people in linguistically rich communities already, right? That would be excellent teachers. Like in particular, migrants who have teaching experience or licenses and degrees in their home countries that unfortunately we do not recognize in the United States, right? And so one of the things that we're doing is working directly with folks that fall in this category, so who have prior teaching experience, and we're kind of meeting them like where they are to think about alternative pathways right through this. So I think the question the answer to that question is like, one, I think we do need more robust requirements, and I think we need to think more creatively and flexibly about what it means to have rigorous training and background to work with multilingual learners. Because I think sometimes, and I know I'm guilty of this, in like wanting more like robust standards, we end up eliminating, right, or not considering a pool of people who are, like ideal candidates to teach in our multilingual teacher workforce. I'll pass it over to Magali.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree with that. And in California, I would say we have some of the most robust bilingual teacher expectations and performance expectations. And at the same time, we do not have to compromise between rigorous expectations and supporting beginning bilingual educators, starting from where they are and building their capacity and professional development support once they enter into their own classroom and into the school setting. So that continuity includes building from the knowledge base that we know of the policies that have impacted the multilingual abilities of former EL students who might be in those pathways for Grow Your Own, the Career Ladder Paraprofessional pathways, the State Seal of Biliteracy recipients. So the dynamic is complex, and yet we have a very solid knowledge base of what high quality bilingual teacher preparation might look like. So then it's up to us. We're the preparers of those teachers. And we need to do away with some of the ideological myths about, language varieties and language standardization and standard practices and what native-like proficiency means. Because if we start from where our teachers are, we want to have them model those practices with the students that they have as well in their classrooms.
And I also wanted to mention school and district leadership. That also is a key component, just to name that, school principals also need preparation in the education of multilingual learners, and school district leaders as well. I mean, you heard from Norma, and she has a stance, right? And that is a stance where there are challenges at times to the provision of bilingual education. But if you have that stance, that's something and you have the knowledge base, it's something that you're able to navigate in a way that is done more easily if you do have that preparation and support.
And toggling back on that, Kate, we did a survey about 4 years ago of state and district leaders around what their perceptions are of the preparation of bilingual educators in this growth trajectory of demand for bilingual programs. And they all said, oh yes, we're growing our bilingual dual language programs. We want you to produce more teachers. And then we also asked, what kind of professional development are you offering beginning bilingual teachers? And they said, oh, we really don't touch that. They'll figure it out on their own. Basically, that was their response. So to that point, we really need to build understanding and capacity to really strengthen the bilingual teacher educator workforce so that they are not just recruited, but they're also retained and supported in their practice.
Thank you. We have lots of work to do, right, in the whole bilingual teacher pipeline. I'm going to ask a somewhat different question that we haven't really touched upon, but it's an important one. And that is that the EL student population is far from homogeneous, and an increasing number of school districts are serving super diverse EL student populations, meaning that the children speak a large number of different languages. And so it's not always practical then in that case to create a dual language program for each language that is each of the home languages, right, that are in the school. So since that's not possible, what can be done to support these students to make sure that the home language is leveraged? And I'll just open this up to anyone who wants to weigh in.
I'll jump in. A couple of years ago, we had an opportunity to do student interviews with super diverse adolescents around their experiences in school, about what worked for them. This is about 20 students across the state, 29 students. I'll put it in the chat. And we asked them what what were the most effective things that they experienced in schools from their educators, from the systems? These were ever EL. So they were former English learners. They had bilingual backgrounds from a variety of language groups, and they had some really interesting things to say about how their assets were uplifted and what they did to enhance their own bilingual superpowers. So it's really about the community context, but they really valued and appreciated educators recognizing that they have these abilities. And it's not that complex, and allowing them opportunities in the school to be able to utilize, regardless of the instructional program type, to be able to utilize the assets that they had with other peer-like groups. And they mentioned their peer groups as really unique providers of support, their family groups, and that connection with the educators who supported them. So I'll put that in the chat too.
I'd love to jump
and I-
in. Oh, sorry.
Anya, you go.
I just would love to jump in and underscore the power of the school to transform the culture and the community. And when you acknowledge and value whether or not you have a program and you know, the ability to mount a dual language program, it really does transform the partnership with families, bringing families into the classroom from the earliest grades and having them use all their language assets, read to the kids, sing to the kids, etc. All of that has a huge influence on the children, on the community at large. Definitely, we know the integration of language development in, through, and across content is so critical for all students. And so, but for English learners and for definitely in super diverse classrooms. And meanwhile, it supports all students. And I guess last thing I would say is that teachers doing work and having the time and support to do some work to understand the languages and the cultures that their students speak and their families speak, and to be able to understand and contrast how language works in English versus how it works in another, you know, in their home language. But teachers need that time and support to do that. But that has huge implications for the kid to understand they're not errors, you know, when they're approximating. They're actually, it's linguistic genius, right? They're using their language assets from one language and applying them maybe to English, vice versa. So those kinds of mindsets, but also then the pedagogy that supports that is so critical.
And what I had wanted to add before was about translanguaging pedagogy. So, you know, we've historically thought of English as a second language or English as a new language programs as English monolingual spaces where students, when there aren't the critical mass to offer a bilingual education program, what they receive is monolingual instruction. But that's starting to shift, and translanguaging is a way to do that, where teachers, educators, even when they don't speak the languages of their students, are able to support, engage, bring in their students' language practices. And so there's a lot out there about, I just would highlight the CUNY New York State Initiative on Emergent Bilinguals Translanguaging Guide, which talks about how educators can use translanguaging practices in their classrooms.
And I'll just add a couple things. I think these are all great responses. I'll just add a few things that I've seen in districts and schools that I think have been really effective ways of supporting students' language development and their own sense of self and well-being in school in contexts where bilingual programs may not be feasible. Those are things like community liaisons. So districts hiring people from the language communities who can liaise and bring in the families and community members and students. Having materials in school like bilingual books in the languages of the community, being sure to offer robust translation, again, drawing on the community members to provide that. And then, of course, teachers and teacher aides who speak those languages, critically important. Even if the program is not a bilingual program, those teachers can still draw on and use those languages. Also, buddy systems. I've seen districts and schools where they'll match a student with another student who speaks that same language so that they're able to support each other. So just wanted to point out those specific ideas that I've seen.
Well, we are almost at time, so I'm going to briefly just say that we've got a couple of questions asking for resources. And one was, Alana, you spoke about a study about graduation and obtaining a diploma. Where could they find this? And then also, if we want to build capacity in our communities using research, where would you guide us and what would you highlight with parents? I'm going to put in a shameless plug for SEAL. We have a fantastic website that has phenomenal resources, including awesome videos to show that really focus on how you communicate about the power of bilingualism to parents. So I would encourage you to use that resource. I know we also have a slide, I think, with some resources at the end. And then I would encourage you to go to any of these individuals' websites and you will find phenomenal resources. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Leslie for the closing.
Thank you, Martha, and thank you to our amazing panelists. Since I was muted at the beginning, I will go ahead and introduce myself again. My name is Leslie Villegas. I'm a senior policy analyst at New America, where I focus on English learner education in pre-K through 12. And next slide, please, Emily. If you can go to the slide on resources. Yep. As Martha was talking about, if you are interested in any of the resources talked about today or shared today, please scan this QR code and we will be updating it after the event as well with some of the impromptu resources that came up and it will automatically refresh. So, and you should all have access to it. So just if you scan the code right now, we will just go ahead and update that after the event. And yeah, that is all the time we have today. And so on behalf of New America and SEAL, we would love to thank all of our panelists and moderators and audience members for joining us today. This event was brought to you through a strategic alliance between SEAL and New America that predates the current political environment. And I hope that you walk away today knowing that partnerships like this are even more important now. And among all the uncertainty, there is strength in joining forces with organizations with shared goals and missions, and there's a lot of them out there. And it's important that we continue to identify these strategic partners to align ourselves with and tap into each other's strengths and expertise to continue to push EL education forward. And so that is the I guess overarching message that I have for everybody today. And thank you everybody for attending.